Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for joining the seminar. This is the third time that I'm presenting, and the first 2 times I was talking more about generally my research agenda, my research program. This time Michael asked me to talk more about specifically my career award project, which has just started, so I won't be able to show many results, but hopefully still provide some useful information to maybe initiate collaboration and maybe also help prospective career proposal writers in the process. So first of all, I only started thinking about career proposal submission last year while I was going up for tenure, so I really only had one shot. And I had the proposal idea in mind for a while, but usually when I tried to write something up the years before, something else got funded and I didn't end up doing it. But finally last year I started putting something on paper. I worked a lot with Spatial to create a 1-page pitch document, which then I shared with some program managers. So for me, really finding the right program took longer than writing the actual proposal. I started with the physical oceanography program. I had been funded by them, and I am funded by them. And a colleague of mine had just moved there as a program manager, so I was fairly certain that they would probably like my idea. Turned out not to be true. They said it was not enough process-based, physics-based process understanding in the proposal. So I moved on to the Climate and Large-Scale Dynamics program, which is also funding my work. And I knew the program manager, so I thought, okay, that will probably work. And same, similar response. Didn't like the idea, didn't want to move forward with it. So at that point, I was basically ready to give up and move on with my life. Debbie Reinhardt at the time, she was the FCI director, and before she retired, she made me promise to try one more program. And I pretty much randomly picked the Humans, Disasters, and the Built Environment program, which I never thought really would be a good fit. But interestingly, the program manager invited me for a Zoom meeting. I gave my pitch presentation, which I also practiced before with Saiful and other experts from my department who provided some good feedback. And eventually the project got funded through that program at total funding is $550,000 over 5 years. I would like to walk you a little bit through the project objectives, the different tasks. Before doing so, I want to define some of the terminology that I will be using. When I talk about spatial clustering or spatial compounding, what I mean is that sometimes the same relatively long coastline stretch, like here you can see the example of Hurricane Michael, if this coastline stretch is affected multiple times historically in the data that we have, simultaneously by a storm surge, then this leads to what we call spatial clustering or spatial compounding. And that is very important from an emergency response and preparedness perspective. For example, if you put your staging area for emergency response into a spot that is also affected, then that may have pretty severe consequences. When I talk about temporal clustering or temporal compounding, then I refer to the same coastline. For example, the city of Jacksonville, city of St. Petersburg, being affected in pretty close succession by multiple different events, different storms that cause storm surges. And here is an example of Hurricanes Marco and Laura, which in 2020 both entered the Gulf of Mexico, and early forecasts had both of them making landfall just within 48 hours in pretty much the same location in the northern Gulf of Mexico. That didn't happen in the end. Luckily, Marco weakened, but Laura made landfall as a Category 4 hurricane and caused quite some damage. So the overarching hypothesis of my project was that ignoring these spatial and temporal compounding effects, which is currently done in risk assessment, could lead to a misrepresentation of the actual coastal flood risk, and that could then lead to maladaptation moving forward as we try to adapt and make our coastlines more resilient as sea levels continue to rise and hurricane characteristics also continue to change. So in terms of research objectives, the first one is pretty simple. We use data, in situ tide gauge data, some numerical model hindcast. Some of those we produced ourselves in my group, so we had a good reference, could make a good case in the proposal that we had developed this data set, which could be leveraged for the work. The idea is to look at where these spatial and temporal clusters actually exist. The project has a global focus, so we use data from the entire global coastline, and we try we will use different methods to identify those spatial clusters, how large they are, where are the centers of those spatial clusters. We'll use different techniques, and the same for the temporal clustering. So as a result, I will hopefully have more information relatively soon about where we have these hotspots of clustering. We had a proof of concept paper published in 2020 that one of my postdocs, Alejandra Enriquez, wrote. She was P3 funded, so we had the freedom to work on this unfunded analysis, which then led to the funding of the career proposal. So that was a pretty good return of investment from the P3 program point of view. She wrote that paper about spatial clustering, the first global assessment really that's out there where someone has looked at the global coastline and identified those spatial clusters where it's more likely that larger areas are affected simultaneously by the same storm surge event. And here you just see some results on the left-hand side that's based on a statistical analysis. So we see one circle here, the red circle, and what this basically shows us is how likely is it, if this point is affected by a storm surge, how likely is it that all these other points are also affected by a storm surge? And not surprisingly, left and right, there's a lot of red, which means quite likely if this area is affected, then a little bit left and right will also be affected. But you can also see yellow and some orange in places that are pretty far away. And at the same time, you can see some blue, which means it's quite unlikely that this area is impacted at the same time as this area is impacted. So there are these unconnected coastline stretches, but there's still spatial clustering evidence in the data. So coastline stretches that are pretty far away and possibly even unconnected may be affected simultaneously relatively often. And the same is shown on the right-hand side. And you see Hurricane Michael's footprint, the area that was affected by Hurricane Michael here at the bottom left, and Hurricane Matthew in the bottom right. So those are examples of events which likely contributed to this clustering. So from this analysis, we knew that we could do that, and we could also show that the model data that we had, the storm surge hindcast information that we produced, is fit for purpose for this type of analysis. This figure we produced just for the proposal, very, very preliminary assessment of the temporal clustering using tide gauge data from the Key West location. We used high thresholds and looked at the inter-arrival times between storm surges, which are typically modeled with an exponential distribution. And we show here at the bottom when these solid lines exceed the dashed line, just means the exponential distribution is not a very good assumption. And that's what can lead to misrepresentation of the inter-arrival times if we simulate large numbers of storm surge events for coastal flood risk assessments. Second objective, I'll go through that relatively quick because we haven't really done any work on it yet. The idea here is to look for changes in those clusters. Is there a tendency for those clusters to become bigger or smaller? Do we see places where this temporal clustering is happening more often or less often? Do we see tendencies for storm surges to occur more often in a relatively short time period, for example? We will use large-scale climate modes such as ENSO, which just reflects the El Nino and La Nina activity, to see if those large-scale climate modes have any effect on the clustering. And again, we use different techniques to do that. Third objective is to actually build a statistical model. So we want to build a model that allows us to simulate storm surges at the global scale pretty efficiently, while explicitly accounting for the spatial and temporal clustering. And there are different techniques out there that can be leveraged based on copulars, multivariate extreme value distributions, wavelet-based approaches. So we'll play around with some of those and try to come up with a model that accounts for those spatial and temporal clusters. Last research objective then is to take this large data set of storm surges that we can generate and actually look at risk metrics. We can, for example, then answer questions such as, what's the likelihood that Florida experiences $100 billion of losses in 1 year alone because of storm surge impact? Maybe because of temporal clustering. At the same time, from the spatial clustering perspective, we could ask, what's the chance that the port of Miami, the port of Jacksonville, and the port of Tampa has to shut down at the same time? Or what is the likelihood that multiple military installations are affected at the same time, which then becomes a matter of national security. And finally, we also want to at least start branching out into other types of hazards and see how this framework can maybe be expanded to include other types of natural hazards such as extreme rainfall or river discharge events. It is a career proposal, so it has educational objectives. The first one And I encourage everyone who writes a career proposal to not focus on that too much. I did include it, and every single reviewer said revising curriculum is part of your job and not part of a career proposal. So I would not do that again. The second objective was actually highlighted as very interesting by most reviewers, where a group of students is usually brought over to Florida from the IHE Delft community over in the Netherlands. It's usually students from developing countries. 30 or 40 of them come to Florida, and they experience, they go through training events, they visit USGS, they visit some coastal sites. There are some short courses, and we will be involved in this program going forward. And I hope to also take some UCF senior undergrad and graduate students to participate. And actually 3 of my PhD students that I have right now went through that program. So I will also use that as a recruitment tool. The last one that was also highlighted by all reviewers as very positive was the collaboration with the Orlando Science Center. Those of you who have been there may have seen this large 6-foot sphere that's hanging from the ceiling, and stuff can be projected onto that sphere. And since our work is global, we hope to produce some interesting data that can be projected on the sphere, and then probably also go and give some talks to engage the community and talk about the work that we are doing on sea level rise and storm surges and coastal flooding. And then finally, we of course have a lot of collaboration going on with federal and state level stakeholders, and we want to make sure that the science that we produce is also actionable. So we also have some webinars lined up to discuss our results with those stakeholders. And this is the team. Alex here at the top, she is the one who wrote the paper. Without that paper, I think we would not have been able to make a strong case to get the project funded. Most of those postdocs were supported by P3 at some point. Dr. Jane is now a research assistant professor, continually funded by Water Management District, Army Corps, also started as a P3 postdoc scholar. So again, the return of investment from this program, I think, is amazing. Ariadna here is a student who I recruited, and that wasn't so easy. I really wanted to recruit a student with a background that's typically underrepresented in STEM. So finding a Hispanic female scientist to join the civil engineering department at UCF was a bit of a challenge, but I'm really glad that she arrived 2 months ago, and we are just now really ramping up the project. Thank you.